Hello, welcome to SIY-Sew It Yourself. I'm your host, Stephanie Soebbing from Quilt Addicts Anonymous. Today we have a really fun project that I actually designed. It is super easy. Anybody can do it. This is actually the very first sewing project I had my daughter do when she was learning to sew when she was 5 years old in kindergarten. So if she can do it and have it turn out great, so can you. It is a Quilt-As-You-Go double-sided placemat. This is the perfect project to do when you're just learning, because we're going to do the entire thing with a walking foot. 1/4 inch seams don't really matter all that much, neither does precision piecing, and you can make it double-sided by using some of those too pretty to cut up prints. So first we're going to get everything prepped to get ready to sew, and then we're just going to whip through these guys. The pattern with one strip roll and some backing fabric, you're able to make 4 placemats and a coordinating table runner. You also could make more placemats too if you want, and that's perfectly fine instead of that. It's also a good project to use those batting scraps for. You know, the parts you cut off the sides when your batting, pre-cut batting is a little bit too large. This is great use for that. Today I'm going to be using an Anna Maria strip set from Brave. She is one of the fabulous designers from FreeSpirit Fabrics. SIY, by the way, is brought to you by the Jaftex family of fabrics. That is FreeSpirit, Henry Glass, Studio E, and Blank. And they have lots of gorgeous fabrics that work for you no matter what your style is. And you can grab these at a quilt shop near you. Just head to SIY-Sew-It-Yourself.com for a list of participating quilt shops, both brick and mortar and online, where you can get some of these goodies. A great way to say thanks for them for providing you with free tutorials and the patterns is to make sure you are shopping from a Jaftex retailer. All right, so I'm going to be making one placemat in today's tutorial, but the process is the same whether you're making a placemat or a table runner. So you will have all the skills you need to go with that. I'm going to start by first cutting my backing fabric. This is something, since it's Quilt-As-You-Go, as you're piecing, you also are quilting it at the same time, so it saves you tons of time. And if you want, you can just follow the instructions and cut wherever on some pretty fabric. Or if you have something like this, which this is also from Anna Maria Brave, we can make sure to center some of these motifs, so that way you essentially have a double-sided placemat. This is fabulous if you have little ones, kids or grandkids that often spill stuff, because you can get a couple more uses out of it before you have to throw it into the wash, and you can just flip that baby over. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be a little fancy. I'm going to fussy cut it so that way my fabric here is in the center with this motif. Now, if this is your plan, if this is what you want to do, make sure you're just getting a little bit extra fabric so that way you have some room to play when it comes to centering everything. So the first thing I'm going to do is flip everything out so that I'm not cutting by 2 widths of fabric. I want to make sure that I'm cutting it a single width like this, so that way I can make sure it's centered all the way down. Now I'm going to be cutting a 13-inch by width of fabric strip. So if I just line this up with the edge, 13 inches is right here, which means this first one is definitely not centered, which is not what we want to have happen. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to move it down a little bit here. All right, so to make sure that I have this centered, I'm taking my 6.5-inch square ruler and I am lining up the center here with the center of my diamond there, and then also with the selvage over here. And I'm just going to make a mark with my friction gel pen on the side there. And I'm also going to move up a little bit more, and I'm just going to kind of work up a little bit doing that. That way I can make sure that I keep it nice and centered going up. Now, as I'm looking at this, it's kind of coming in a little bit. Like it starts here and then it comes in and comes in. So I have some choices to make. One, it's going to be okay if they're not perfectly centered all the way up. But what I can do here is I can just kind of pick one and go with it. And I think that that is going to work out all right for me. Now that I'm happy with this placement, I'm going to go ahead and cut straight down. And I do have my inch line even with the selvage there. So that's kind of like my area to make sure it stays nice and straight. Now what I like to do is leave about 4 or 5 inches here with the fabric kind of pulled back, because that's going to give me something to line up, make sure I'm nice and square on, and make sure I like the positioning of everything going up. I do, so I'm going to go ahead and give that a cut. And we're just going to keep that process up until we make it all the way across. Now I flipped it around so my cut edge is on the left side, and I'm just going to fold that over so that way my cut edges are lined up exactly on top of each other. Now I'm going to take my ruler, and I've got the 13-inch mark lined up over here with my cut edge, and I'm just going to work my way up the fabric. Now before I move on into cross-cutting this one, I just want to take a second to show you guys that this is why you want to have extra fabric, because if I want to make sure that this is centered in every single one of my placemat backs, you want to make sure you have extra fabric, because you're not going to be able to use this. You're going to have to start right about there and cut to about here if that's what you want to do. So you're going to lose about 6 inches of that. Now, if that's something you don't care about, then just keep on cutting your 13-inch wide strips and don't worry about it. Or maybe pick a really busy backing fabric to where it really doesn't matter what gets cut where. But if you want to make sure you have things centered, that's how you do it. All right, so now we're gonna cross cut this into a 17-inch wide piece. So we've already got the 13, now we're gonna do 17. I find this a lot easier to do by just using the mat to measure. So what I'm doing is I'm lining up my cut edge here with just any line, ruler line on the mat. And I can see I've got my 17-inch here. So I'm just gonna kind of scooch that down. So that way I've got about equal on 0 and 17. So I know that that's gonna be nice and centered. So that's kind of how I do that part. Makes it a lot faster. All right, so I'm gonna set my backs to the side for now, and we're gonna cut up our strip roll. So what I'm about to do is something that you don't want to do with a dull rotary cutter blade, but it's going to save you a ton of time. This is how I cut pretty much every single quilt that I do, and it saves me so much time. What I'm doing is I am just lining up the edges of my piece so that way the pinked edge is even with the inch line on my mat. And then I have it hanging a little bit off so that way my selvage is hanging off just a smidge. And then I'm going to go up, and you want to be careful not to hit the one below it. And I'm just going to line it right up. So I kind of like hold that up and then lay it down on top. That way I'm not budging the one underneath. And I'm going to keep doing that until I have filled up my entire mat. And by doing it every 2 inches, that ensures that you only have a little bit of overlap and you're gonna be okay. Now this is a super forgiving project. So if you decide, like if you get off just a smidge, it's gonna be okay. But this is what I do whenever I'm cutting, and eventually you get to a point where you can line it up absolutely exactly on and cut everything super, super fast. All right, so now what I'm going to do, I have to cut this to a 13.5-inch strip. So I'm going to lay this out so that I have my 13.5-inch even with the top and the bottom. And I'm going to really firmly put my whole palm down on the mat with my pinky to the side, and I'm going to slice up. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll pause in the middle and go all the way up. That'll help keep the ruler from shifting. And now all of these on the side are going to be more than 13.5. These are also going to be more than 13.5. You can cut off the selvage if you want to, or you can just avoid it as you sew. Doesn't matter, whatever you want to do with that. At this point, what I do is I'm going to stack them by color, which is going to make life a little easier when we start putting everything together. I am just going to go ahead. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk around to the other side of the mat, and I'm going to cut off my selvages here real quick. It's probably worth noting that depending on what your width of fabric is, that your centerpiece may actually end up being wider than 13.5 inches. That's fine. Don't worry about that at all. you're going to be able to still have plenty because these are going to be trimmed down to 12 inches. Now here you can see I've got some more yellow. So I'm just going to stack my yellow on top and let that be my yellow stack as I'm going along. And then it'll have kind of read the same color, but we'll be able to make these super scrappy. All right, I'm going to continue that process until I've gotten through my entire strip roll. All right, so I've got everything laid out by color, and you can mishmash this however which way you want. I think I'm just gonna go in color order because it looks pretty and let that be. At this point, what I like to do is, because I've separated this by color, I'm gonna be able to kind of create and just pull, and they will all read as yellow or they'll all read as orange. And so you have to think less as you're going through the project. And whenever I can think less when I'm sewing something, I'm good with that. I'm very excited about that situation. All right, so we are going to get going on the actual sewing part of this, and we're going to do the entire thing with a walking foot. For my first quilting project, I had a walking foot. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't use it for a king size quilt. But this is a walking foot. It has this little attachment. Sometimes it's a claw, sometimes it's a hook, but either way, it's going to loop around the lever that goes up and down when your needle goes up and down. Or if it's a lever, it'll sit above. Look at your machine manual to see what it is. And if it didn't come with your machine, go to where you purchase your machine to get one that will work with it. And then this will sit around the screw where your shank is. And what is lovely about this is it has feed dogs on the top. So as this goes up and down, those feed dogs are going to go up and down. So when you're quilting or putting binding on, or in this case doing Quilt-As-You-Go, what it does is it feeds your top fabric, your batting fabric, and your backing fabric through at all the same rate. So if you don't use one of these, you're likely to have things kind of stretch on you, and then it's not going to work quite right. So this is something you definitely want to have, and we're going to sew our entire project with it. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out my fabric, and this would be best on a flat surface, not on top of your fabrics there. And then I'm going to lay my scrap batting that I've cut to the same size as my backing fabric, and I'm going to lay that on top, and I'm just going to smooth it out nicely. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to trim everything down later. If you are into spray basting, you can do that, but honestly, that's not even necessary. I find that as long as you are using a cotton or a cotton blend batting, it sticks really well to your backing fabric. Some of the polyester battings, depending on what manufacturer you're using, can really slip and slide around. So get yourself a nice cotton, and it will like to just stay together, and you'll be good to go. So now to get started, I'm just going to grab 2 to start with. So I'm going to lay my first strip even with the edge of my batting and my backing fabric. And I'm just going to smooth that out. You don't have to pin it or anything in place. You can if you want to. And then the second one, I'm just going to lay right on top of that, making sure that my pinked edges are even. Now, it's very likely that your fabrics might extend beyond your backing fabric. Totally fine if it does. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to take our walking foot and we're going to stitch down this edge here. And you kind of, if you know where your 1/4 inch is on your walking foot, that's ideal. But if you don't know where it is, then just sew with the edge of your walking foot, even with the pinking like I have here. And that'll be good enough. It doesn't matter if it's a perfect 1/4 inch seam. It doesn't even matter if it's a straight seam. But what does matter is that you don't do it super teeny tiny for your seam, because then this is, especially for a placemat that's going to get washed a lot, that's going to pop open and you're going to have a problem. So if anything, err on the side of that seam being a little bit too fat and you'll be just fine. Now the one final setup thing I'm doing is I am putting in a bobbin thread that is going to match with my backing fabric, because since this is going to be a double-sided placemat, we want to make sure that it looks very nice and pretty on the back as opposed to, you know, whatever is in there already. All right, so I'm going to take my placemat and I'm going to roll up the end. This is going to go in my throat space, and I really just kind of want it out of the way. You don't want to be too close to it because we do need to sew this unencumbered, but just get it nice and rolled up for now. We're going to unroll it as we go. All right, so starting at the edge, I'm just going to sew straight down. And if you want, you can actually increase your stitch length a little bit to this. I'm going to increase mine to 3.0. And I'm just making sure that everything is nice and aligned and that I'm stitching as straight as I can. So when we look at this, we can see that we have a nice, good 1/4 inch seam here. Our edges are nice and aligned, so we're not going to worry about something popping out that shouldn't later on. And everything got sewed all the way through, so we are doing good there. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press this to one side, and then we're just going to repeat that process till we fill the entire placemat. So first I set that seam, and then I'm going to press that over. And you want to get it nice and flat. Spend a little bit of time at this point, because if you end up with like a buckle in there at this point, it's always going to be there, because you are going to be stitching as you sew your next piece on, you're also quilting it. You can see here that we've got our quilting line here from our first one. So you just want to keep that in mind as you're going, so that way you don't end up with little lumps and bumps that you don't want to have there. So this is why I keep all of my fabric sprayed out here on my work surface, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to do two things first here. One, we've already used this fabric right here, so I'm going to grab all of these and I'm going to move them down to the bottom of my pile. That ensures that I'm not using it too much. I'm going to use the next black one next. Same with this one, we've already used it. So I'm going to move that to the bottom of my pile, so that way I'm going to use a different green for the next one, and each one will be a little unique for each piece. Now I'm going to go with this one next. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that, and we're going to lay it right sides together with the one that I've already sewn, and that's going to go on next. And while I'm here, I'm going to take those fabrics and I'm just going to lay them underneath. Now there's only 2 different fabrics in that pile, so you're definitely going to use that one more frequently than some of the ones that might have 3 different fabrics in it. This one just has 1 type of fabric in it, but it'll give you a good variety as you go, so that way you don't ever end up with the same one right next to each other. One other thing that I would do is, like, these 2 prints are the same, they're just in different colors. So if those were next to each other, same with these, I would use something else. I would flip it to the bottom and I would pick something else for that first one. So that way you just have really good variety and it looks scrappy without really having to plan it out being scrappy. All right, so I'm just going to line that up as I did with the others. We're going to roll in just like we did before, and you're going to be rolling less and less with each one, and we're just going to stitch down. So that process is going to be the same as we go. So we're going to do that little bit of music montage, but the process is the exact same from here on out, whether you're doing your placemat or the table runner. Now, when you hit this point and you've got about a ½ inch left, you could sew more, or you could just measure and kind of see where you're at to decide if you've got enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure this. We're going to trim it down to 16 inches. So I pretty much just barely have 16 inches here. So I think I am going to leave it, because if I feel underneath here, I do have fabric all the way to the edge here. So I think I'm going to be okay. But if you want to sew a little bit onto this last one, you absolutely can do that. You're just going to have a skinny strip at the end. All right, so I'm going to show you guys how to trim this down, but this is the same process you're going to do for all of your placemats and your table runner. It's just going to be a little bit longer depending on what you're doing. So now it's time to trim this down to 12 inches by 16 inches. I'm going to start on this side because this is my shortest side here. And I'm going to line it up as best I can with the edge of that fabric. Now, if it's not all the way to the edge, it's not really the end of the world because we are going to put binding on it. Like this one is about a 1/16 of an inch in, just in this little section here. But I'm nice and lined up with my 2 1/4 inch here. So I'm going to go ahead and just trim off this end here. Now I'm going to give that a 90-degree turn, and we are going to now line up any inch mark with the bottom here. And then since we have a lot of fabrics that are hanging beyond, I want to trim as close to the edge as I can here. In this case, I've got my fabric and batting that I can see right here. So I'm going to go ahead and trim pretty close to that top. All right, so now I have 2 cut edges, so it makes it a lot easier to trim from this side. Now, if I want this to still be straight up and down, you might want to consider trimming from the back. Otherwise, you can use the cut edge on your other side of your mat to trim as well. I'm just going to go ahead and give this a measure, and it looks like I've got it pretty dead center here anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a flip here. So now what I can do is I can line up with the 0 inch mark on my ruler and then any inch line so that I know I'm nice and square. And just like before when we were lining things up with the 13 inch mark, I'm going to go ahead and line up with the 16 here. Now I've got a little bit of wiggle room, so if I wanted to come in a little bit, like if it was a little tight, I could. But I'm going to go ahead and just give this a trim here. Actually, here's what we actually will do. I'm going to bring it out just a smidge. That way I'm going to have a little bit more equal on either side here. That way I've got a little bit, about the same amount extra here as I do here. That is totally optional. You could just chop it at 16 and call it a day. Make sure that I've got my backing going all the way to the edge, and I do. And I'm going to cut this truly at 16 now. And sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. It just depends on how I'm feeling that day and how particular I want to get. All right, we're going to give this a turn again. And again, I'm lining up my edges with inch lines and my edge here with 0 inch. And now we're going to trim it down to 12 inches. So I'm going to line up right here and just trim straight down that. And again, if you're trying to fit and make sure your motif is perfectly centered in the back, this is a point where you could flip it over and you can look at it from this direction instead if you want. So here I'm going to take a peek at it, and I'm going to make sure that that looks pretty good, and I think it does. We're going pretty much down the center for both of those. So I'm going to go ahead and trim at 12. All right, so now we have our placemat trimmed up to 12 by 16. That way we are good to go. This is the same process if you're trimming your table runner, just obviously it's going to be a little bit longer, but the width is about the same. And this is just, it's really fun. It's really cute. What I do is I make all of these and get them trimmed. And then with all of my extra 13.5 inch strips, I sew it into one long binding, and then that way I've got continuous binding to go around the edges, and I get less waste that way, and I'm able to really use the entire strip roll very wisely, and we get super scrappy binding going around everything, and it looks absolutely fantastic. So this is a really fun way to create some fun table runners for your home. You can really customize it to your colors and your tastes. Really have some fun. And again, this is a really easy project. This is the very first project I ever had my daughter sew when she was 5 years old in kindergarten. And was it perfectly straight? Nope. Did she have a blast doing it and really enjoy using that because she made it? Absolutely. So it's really a lot of fun, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. All right, well, make sure you head over to SIY-Sew-It-Yourself.com to get the instructions for this, and make sure you also check out your SIY participating retailer. You can find all that information on the website. And this was just, it's such a fun pattern. I've made it so many times. Again, this one is my pattern. I'm Stephanie Sebbing from Quilt Addicts Anonymous, and this is just a really fun one to work with. And if you don't have a strip roll handy, or your favorite collection didn't come in one, then you can always cut your own 2.5-inch strips from your favorite collection. Just get like some 1/2 or 1/3 yard cuts, and you'll be able to get a really good variety to make that work, and you can have a lot of fun with this. And again, big thanks to SIY-Sew It Yourself. They are from the Jaftex family of fabrics. That is FreeSpirit, which we're working with today, Henry Glass, Blank, and Studio E. All right, until next time, happy quilting.